Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the Honourable Member for Hastings, Lennox and Eglinton, Tyendinaga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise here today to speak to our Opposition Day motion, the reintroduction of the Canadian Sovereignty Act. But before I get to the Act, I'd like to talk about the change in the political landscape between its first introduction and today. Canada is at a precipice. We are facing a very real economic threat. The Canadian Sovereignty Act is a strong step in the right direction. It will remove barriers and red tape that has held Canada back. It calls on the Prime Minister to promote investments by removing capital gains tax on reinvestments in Canada, entice provincial governments to open their markets up, build pipelines, improve access to the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, and start at least one new greenfield LNG project. Numerous ministers have stood up in this place signaling their willingness to work with the opposition. It is time to make good on that promise, Mr. Speaker, and it needs to happen as soon as possible because Canadian industry and jobs are suffering. For nearly a year, Canada has been at the receiving end of unprovoked and unjustifiable tariffs. The rationale behind why Washington decided to implement these taxes can be debated ad nauseum, but functionally, the answer to that question is irrelevant. The decisions of the President are out of our hands, but how we as elected representatives, and more importantly, Canadians as a society respond, is not. There are two pieces of advice that should be obvious to anyone looking in from the outside of the negotiations that even the most casual of observers will conclude. Firstly, we are stronger together than we are apart. That applies to the negotiating table just as much as it does to the floor of the Commons. Secondly, patience is wearing thin. Offering at least some form of openness and transparency to stakeholders, opposition parties, and more importantly, the families and business owners suffering under these tariffs will go an extremely long way in dispersing the fog and noise surrounding these negotiations. Before going any further, I need to reiterate that the tariffs the President of the United States has implemented are unjustified, unfair, unprovoked, and most importantly, unnecessary. They are causing untold levels of harm in strategic sectors on both sides of the border. They are shuttering plants and foundries. Their immediate effects on the Canadian economy are paralyzing, and the response of Canadian workers, Canadian voters, is predictable, and most importantly, more than understandable. And Canada is responding. The government is making efforts, as is the opposition, and we are doing that through our Canadian Sovereignty Act. It will allow Canada to build more, to extract more, to import more, and most importantly, to thrive more. And Canada's Conservatives, despite the claims of certain members on the other side, have shown a willingness to work with the government when the government proposes sensible, results-oriented policies like C5. The Canadian Sovereignty Act builds on that economic stewardship by giving the government the tools to help spur on private sector development across the nation by removing the regulatory shackles their Prime Minister's predecessor bound this government with. The legacy of the unfair, unjust Trump tariffs will be an extremely painful but valuable lesson for Canadian policymakers. The importance of diversification and self-reliance is an increasingly unstable global threat environment. Mr. Speaker, while the outlook is bleak, there has been a noticeable shift in at least the rhetoric coming from that side of the House since the previous election. For a decade, we had a government that was staunchly anti-pipeline. Any resource development project posed an immediate and direct existential threat to the planet. Defense spending was seen as an unnecessary and abrasive, ironically enough, because our geography and proximity to the United States meant we didn't have a need for an efficient, independent military. Multilateral dialogue with despots in Iran and China were the approach of the world's most recent post-national state. Despite having largely the same caucus and much of the same cabinet, the Prime Minister who campaigned on acting as a foil to what he calls unstable and unpredictable actors has committed verbally to adopting some of the positions we have championed, at least in principle. The government worked with the Conservative opposition to pass C5, which gives the government the capacity to fast-track natural resource projects in the national interest. government, after a decade of pressure, finally agreed to the Conservative-led push to increase defence spending and increased border security, coupled with reduced immigration targets. In my mind, this sizable shift in direction from the government, its cabinet, and caucus can only be explained by one thing: U.S. tariffs. Having campaigned myself on many of these issues, I will not fault the Prime Minister for coming to his senses, even if it took crippling tariffs from a foreign government to prompt a moment of clarity I highly doubt his predecessor was ever willing to entertain. Once again, I'd like to reiterate that these tariffs on Canadian goods and services are unjustified, unfair, unprovoked, and unnecessary, but they have forced Canada to make difficult decisions that should have been made a decade ago. And for that, I applaud the government for making those select few difficult decisions in principle. That has caused a rupture in his caucus that we are seeing play out in real time. His speech at Davos was well written, trading in Ted and Samantha on Main Street with suicides and President Havel, but writing a speech, delivering a speech, that's the easy part, Mr. Speaker. What is difficult is actually delivering on those promises. To that end, to achieve that goal of diversifying trade and kickstarting our domestic supply chains and building independence and economic sovereignty here at home, the Conservatives have introduced the Canadian Sovereignty Act. It calls for a battery of changes to the Liberal government's decade of stifling economic growth by repealing unnecessary regulatory and statutory caps like the oil and gas cap, the industrial carbon tax, the EV mandate, the plastic bans, and Bills C-69 and C-48. It calls for a serious investment in our natural resource sectors by fast-tracking projects that create Canadian goods with Canadian resources by Canadian companies, creating Canadian jobs. Mr. Speaker, I think the Prime Minister would do well to follow in the footsteps of his former boss and continue the generational trade diversification carried out by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. His prowess serves as an excellent blueprint to follow as he and his cabinet navigate the treacherous waters of international trade and relations in 2026. The best time to continue diversification was a decade ago. The second best time to diversify is now. Canadians, especially policymakers, need to remember that the relationship between Canada and the United States will go past the President or the Prime Minister. The current occupants of 24 Sussex and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue are minor actors in a much larger, deeper, and historic relationship. We need to remember that. Trade is not finite. We can and should aim to increase trade not only with our European and Asian allies, but seek new emerging markets in Africa, on the subcontinent, and most importantly, repair, renew, and reinvigorate our trade relationship with the United States. During his lauded Davos speech, the Prime Minister glibly dismissed this amorphism of Thucydides on the international order by simply countering the Greek historian's observations with a powerful and deeply insightful quote. Mr. Speaker, it just won't. The Prime Minister assured us that his dealings with petro-dictators and autocrats in Qatar and China, instead of like-minded democracies, is not naive multilateralism. Well, I will leave Parliament with this quote from that same Greek polymath. And their judgment was based more upon blind wishing than upon any sound prediction. For it is the habit of mankind to entrust to careless hope what they long for, and to use sovereign reason to thrust aside what they do not desire. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her remarks today, and I do want to give her some good news. Some of the things she talked about in terms of driving the economy forward actually reside in Bill C-15, which is still before Parliament, and I would encourage her and the Conservative colleagues to work collectively with the government to be able to advance those measures. But the question I have for the honourable member is, she represents a rural riding. She has a lot of farmers in her riding, and she talked quite negatively about the engagement of of the trade arrangement that the government has established with China, which is removing $5 billion worth of exports that are being tariffed right now. That matters for the prairie provinces, matters in Atlantic Canada on seafood. We don't disagree that, of course, the United States will remain an important trading partner, but this government is looking to diversify. Does she really believe, and does she, in the position of the Conservative Party, that we shouldn't have done this for Canadian farmers, that we shouldn't have opened up markets for the second largest economy in the world? Is that her position?
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington, Tynedinega.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government opposite has had 10 years. It's a little bit too little, too late. It's pitting province against province, sector against sector, and with all due respect, this has been a year. If we look at numbers, if we want to talk numbers, the current deficit has doubled. Food inflation is the worst in the G7. If we want to get into crime, Liberal bail continues to release violent repeat offenders. No pipelines have been approved. New and increasing tariffs are shutting down mills, factories, and businesses across the country. So if you think I'm talking negative, it's because we have a really dire situation here in Canada, and something needs to be done about it.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire dans la députée de La Pointe-Lille.
Je voudrais avoir l'opinion de ma collègue sur un des points de leur motion qui parle de donner des primes au libre-échange pour réduire les obstacles au commerce interprovincial. Mais dans le fond, ces obstacles-là, qu'est-ce que c'est sinon les lois linguistiques, les lois environnementales, les règles publiques, la formation de la main-d'œuvre, toutes les normes du travail qui sont propres à chaque province. Dans le fond, c'est vraiment, je pense, une attaque frontale à la souveraineté des provinces qui sont supposées être souverains dans leur champ de compétences. Merci.
Bravo.
The honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington, Tynedinega.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the comment, but with no disrespect, we are talking about the Opposition Day motion of the Canadian Sovereignty Act. This touches energy, this touches economy, this touches environment, and bottom line, Mr. Speaker, we need to cut taxes, we need to unlock investment, and we need to let builders build. I think there's no place right now. Canadians have no appetite for partisanship and throwing stones both ways. We need to get rid of the politics, we need to get rid of the partisanship, and we need pragmatic plans that restore and support economic sovereignty here in Canada. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Mr. Speaker, I listened intently to the member's speech, and I really do appreciate it. But the Liberals have come back and say, well, isn't this the time for diversification? Well, Mr. Speaker, I hate as much as anybody the I told you so phrases, but I remember back in 2007, Stephen Harper said we needed to diversify our markets. He then became the Prime Minister. He signed 43 free trade agreements around the world, built pipelines and pursued pipeline projects to both the West and the East Coast. The time for diversification was decades ago. I'm wondering if my honourable colleague has some comments about that.
Honourable member for Hastings, Lennox and Addington, Tynedinega.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have to recognize that Canada and U.S., we still have the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. We have been diversifying with other nations for many years, long before this current government came into play. Diversification, it doesn't need to be an either or. We don't need to stop internal trade or international trade with Canada-US. We need to restore and reinvigorate that relationship while at the same time fostering new relationships and current trade relationships that we have with other countries. Thank you.
Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. Resuming debate.